let's see. We had a really big garden haul this week, which made me very, very happy. Um, and we're growing mushrooms in our. I have like a Martha's tent with a bunch of different species of mushroom,
Mm.
and one surprised me with an extra flush. Our blue oyster mushrooms had a bigger extra flush, which we weren't expecting to happen. So that was another thing that brought me joy.
Yeah, when the garden brings just unexpected growth and excitement, that's yeah. Just I
Totally.
got a banana. I have a banana tree outside, and usually it's just one. I don't know what you call it, one little thing of bananas. Now I see or pods. I don't know, like 3 extra pods. Just gonna have a lot of smoothies, I guess.
Oh, amazing, amazing. Do you have any citrus trees?
No, I have a very sad medium lemon tree, and if anybody knows me, I could subsist off of lemons, so I have to, like, either plant it somewhere where it gets a little bit more light or think about a more robust lemon tree. How about you?
No citrus, no citrus. Yeah, I grew up in Florida and lived in Los Angeles for many years, so I got very accustomed to fresh local citrus. So it's a different ball game in the Northeast.
Oh, yeah, you guys don't really grow citrus, huh? Wow.
I mean, they're there, but they're not, from around the corner.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay, enough about fruits and vegetables for now. They might make an appearance later. I'm joined today by Dr. Maytha Alhassen. Dr. Alhassen, thanks for being on this live conversation.
Thanks for having me.
I realized when I was trying to put together a title for this conversation how difficult it would be to do so, and why I was all the more excited to have the conversation, because obviously your work is rooted in intersectionality, in the important meaning of that word.
Mm.
But there's also this career intersectionality you have where you've kind of danced across a lot of different forms and media and communities. How do you self describe these days?
I have is my audio okay?
You sound great.
Oh, okay, I thought I heard some feedback, sorry about that. I I was calling myself a freedom doula as a way to catch all the ways I intentionally show up in space and then get a categorization like media practitioner or professor or TV writer, producer, filmmaker, writer, poet. And sometimes I forget about the yoga and other mending modalities that I do. So I think at the heart of all of them, when I've committed to study, to research, it's how can I find, locate, and expand the opportunities for freedom in all these spaces for me, for everybody around me.
Mm. Yeah, could you go a little bit deeper into what you mean by freedom doula and how that kind of threads your work?
I was trained as a traditional birth doula by my friend Latham Thomas, who has this amazing program called Mama Glow. And she focuses on also teaching Black maternal mortality and Black maternity as the foundation of trying to understand how we have the most holistic, healing, protected birth for the person who's pregnant and for the child. And so also extending that. So I thought in the framework of a doula, which is it's hard to conceptualize exactly what a doula does, but they're really an advocate for the birthing person on this process for new life. And of course, there's so many different doulas. There's death doulas, there's postpartum doulas. And so that notion of the doula has been reformatted for all those different specific contexts. And so for me, a freedom doula is somebody who's an advocate, or another word that I like to use, which is, the name of my title of my Substack, which I have not revisited since I started it up, which is Engage Withness. Withness is another way of thinking about it, which is that part of being that advocate, or again, I love witness better than ally, than comrade than any of these other, or solidarian, all these other frameworks, because there's a critical work and intervention being made with the witness, who is a part of the process of a kind of freedom that, uh, you know, I pray all new life gets to breathe.
That's beautiful. Could you talk about, so I love that play on words of witness and witness. And you've just described a bit about how witness plays in.
Yeah,
So let's talk about the witness
yeah,
in the formula.
yeah. So I was starting to write my dissertation. I mean, it's hard to talk about because you're almost all the kind of research that you're doing as a researcher or academic folds into what becomes the dissertation. So prior to that, I was working at the Malcolm X Project at Columbia University with the late Dr. Manning Marable. And so that work started in 2006. So I like to think of Malcolm X as really being this guide in how to think about freedom, justice. He says freedom, justice, and equality. I think about freedom and justice. And as I was studying him and his relationship to freedom, I was also at the same time relearning my Arabic that I was born with, and then lost in response to trying to assimilate into a system that punished me and marginalized me for speaking Arabic. So as I was in this quest at the same time, there was a real spiritual experience that was happening with this dissertation detective work. So I did my master's at Columbia, then I went into USC and did my PhD, and this is a long-winded answer, but to get there, I was realizing that also part of the Black radical tradition, we include like James Baldwin, somebody who has also a heavy influence on my intellectual and spiritual trajectory and wrestling with the moral and ethical uh, understanding of the world. Um, really thinks through freedom and has a long tradition of witness and testimony. And that's the same case in Arabic. So the word for witness, the way that Arabic works is a, a triadic formulation of three letters being the root of a word. And witness shares three letters with testimony and shares three letters with martyr. And it's also the word that's used for the profession of faith in Islam, which is shahada. So you have these concepts, profession. So you're witnessing something as part of your act of professing to Islam. And then you are testifying, and then there's a sort of death involved. How do you make sense of it? So I thought about it as, well, first of all, we have to understand that witness and testimony and testifying are intimately entangled and cannot be torn apart. So you can't just witness something and be a bystander. You are compelled to speak. And then really also engaging with how the three-letter construction is understood in the Quran, because I'm coming from like an Arabic Islamic sort of investigation. Every time that most of the time that shahid, shaheed, again, the things we hear and we're like, oh my God, somebody who's a terrorist who commits suicide, whatever. Those things are very different to the Arabic ear. The Arabic ear hears those words, and especially the Arabic Muslim ear hears those words, and they say, oh, somebody who's witnessing an injustice and stands on the side of the oppressed and must change the condition of the oppressed to a condition of justice instead of injustice. That's what makes you shaheed. That's what makes you shahid. That's what makes you a martyr. So how are all these things connected? Once again, that question emerges, and I conceptualize this idea of when you witness an injustice, a part of you dies on a soul spiritual level, and you can only be reborn in the telling. And so we also know from a Sufi Tasawwuf tradition, there's a lot of emphasis on dying before your death. And the whole point is to really die and shed away. We're also going back to the doula concept too. All these things are so interconnected that birthing in something new, something has to die. And part of the other kind of framework in an Islamic context is our greatest quote unquote sin, although we don't really have the concept of sin, is forgetting. So remembrance is a part of how we reconnect to the divine and to understand justice and to understand freedom. So all the part of witnessing. I had like so many clunky ways I was doing this. I was calling it engage witness. It was so academic. Then I was thinking, oh, you know what? I could just say witness as a way to signify that the testimony and how tied you are to anything you witness. I have so much to say about what we're witnessing on social media or in media in general. But there's a reason that moves people. And there's a reason that either people respond in a variety of ways, which is completely like transforming how they talk about an issue and or going and being on the ground to try to change it.
Mm. Mm. What an amazing answer. Thank you. I have so many pieces I want to pull out from what you said. Malcolm X's idea of freedom, your childhood and how that shaped your understandings. So I want to get to those, but I want to pick up right where you left us right at the end of that answer, which is that question that I think a lot of us on a day-to-day basis are confronting, which is what do we do? How do we approach this sort of hyper object of social media and watching atrocities play out on social media and this inevitable sense of powerlessness, helplessness, an inability to participate kind of take root for many people. And I think that what you're describing with witnessing feels like a real channel for that. So could you just say more, like go more of where you were going to go at the end?
And I think I'm going to be speaking to myself too, because I felt frozen ever since October 7th to say or in a more profound way offer some thoughts, interventions, or show up because I've felt so inundated with some of the worst things I've ever seen, and some of the most painful stories that keep on repeating themselves. And so I would say that sometimes the inclination, if there isn't any momentum or movement around an injustice, is being frozen. And we have the same kind of responses that we do in real life to predators. We have them to seeing things on a screen. That's our nervous system can't make those distinctions. So if we aren't sublimating those activations of our nervous system to a state of alertness, to a state of what people in the quote unquote like healing space call a kind of arousal and animation, then we're going to just feel like we're stuck. We're not moving. But I would say, and again, this is why I say this is more of a message to myself, is when when people sometimes minimize or belittle being in person and chanting, that's a channeling that is happening because people cannot take the onslaught, the overwhelming onslaught of injustice that's laying bare on their soul. And only if you've been disassociative, only if you've decided to just be in the state of frozenness, will you be able to sort of like move on as everything is normal, right? And so what we're contending with is witnessing more than we've ever seen and hearing and reading more than we've ever heard in the world of injustice. So I think there needs to be a proper or a more measured relationship to what am I consuming? And then what am I creating in response to intervening in if I see an injustice? And so sometimes that turns into the most amazing sort of transformations. Like I never would have had Miss Rachel as being like one of the fiercest defenders of detained children, of Palestinian children, of children around the world experiencing anything, and had been so consistent. And I think that she's a true witness. She witnessed something, and she could not hold back, especially given what her messaging was around the importance of childhood development and caring for a child's growth, and then, testifying in the most life-giving way.
Yeah, and being framed as one of the top global anti-Semites, for wanting children to have good lives.
Well, and,
Uh,
the other thing, I'm such, like, a measurement metrics person because I worked in media, and I guess I still continue to work in media, so I think about what weighs in and out. I remember she was honored for, I think, Glamour Woman of the Year. She wore some, like, amazing dress that also where she wore her politics on it, and by far from some of the more it people that were honored, everything on their TikTok feed featuring her just outperformed everybody. So, you can see that as, sure, people are upset that she has so much power in her witnessing, but also where's the pulse of where regular folk are at? And regular folk too are being affected, and I go get my hair done and a hairdresser tells me I can't, these poor kids, you know?
mm,
So we got to think about, and I sit and think about a lot of what regular folk are carrying when we're reading and seeing what we are, with the total abandonment by elites of any kind of social responsibility.
mm. And what like, Miss Rachel has a platform,
Yeah.
and this kind of scales down. I mean, to some extent, everybody has a platform if they want it. But Miss Rachel has a very loud, very large
Yeah.
platform. But thinking about those regular folks who are just carrying this, not to ask you to, like, give a prescription and call it a day, but how can a regular person who's maybe not as, active on social media, but wants to be an engaged witness, what, I don't know, insights or advice would
Yeah.
you share with that person?
I think I have one top line spiritual, to a little bit more granular. How do you do this work practically, or some options that you have? So, on a spiritual sense, I think one of the gravest things that capitalism has done, and patriarchal capitalism, is this disconnect between our understanding of who we are and our gifts, and that being framed, reinforced relationally through our communities. So, first of all, a lot of us are deracinated, uprooted from any sense of community. So, those folks who have witnessed us as being born, and our parents or our grandparents, and understanding what special gift we're born with, we don't have that reflective mirror as much anymore. There are some people and some communities that continue to endure and still have a version of this. So this is part of the freedom doula work I like doing, which is like getting to, what is the gift you were born with? And it could be multiple gifts, but really, I think with the trends of capitalism, you see a inclination or tendency to perform what is the more financially lucrative version of a gift, right? Versus truly understanding. Again, people can disagree. You can be atheist, agnostic, whatever. But the thing that I think about, it comes from sitting and studying with indigenous ancient wisdom cultures, and knowing that there's some kind of soul's truth about why we were put here to be reflected. So I think there's sitting with what that is for you. And then there are things like attending a protest. There are things like running for city council. And I live in LA County, but I'm in one of those cities that has its own city council. I've been tempted to run, although it's very strange because um, it would fulfill my dad's ultimate dreams. He's always wanted me to be a politician, but I see the mismanagement of money. I see the mismanagement of relationship to land. I was in Los Angeles. There's these beautiful kind of pseudo reclaimed lands by Tongva folk called the Kuruvanga Springs, And I say pseudo because it's LAUSD or LA United School Districts land, and they're letting them lease it for $1. Hi, Cam. They're letting them lease it for $1 a year, but that doesn't mean they have like true access to their own land. But it's incredible because they have water springs that are untapped in Los Angeles. And they explained to us that LA was a wetlands. LA had springs all over. And so this idea of a drought is a fiction of municipal management. And there are actually there are springs all over Los Angeles, and they cap them and they go into the storm drains, so we lose our access from pure clean water from the mountains. But they've been able to take that water and rewild the land, grow native plants, nourish the migrant plants that have also emerged. And so even that, just like a relationship with reviving the land, again, I've taken the lead from the original stewards of this land who have, told me there's a tree outside that was planted that's just like spilling everywhere. Lo and behold, its roots are so shallow. It was again from colonizers that brought in a mulberry tree, which does look cute, but in these sort of small home pockets and for the land, it doesn't work. They interfere with all the piping, the clay piping, and the traditional trees that grew here, like a black walnut tree, the roots go very deep, and so it would not even access the piping. So there's a kind of wisdom of also, I think, a long answer, sorry, is there's such a beauty in terms of doing this witness work on such a hyper local level, seeing if your soil is usable. You can test your soil and seeing how you can ameliorate it, make it better. You can see what the native plants are to help them rewild. You can be a part of, I'll give you a really good one, which I don't see people in the movement space talk about enough. I think you can go on Instagram and platform an issue. You can go on TikTok. You can go on X. You can go on Threads. But are you guys going on Nextdoor? Are you going on these neighborhood apps?
Wow.
Those spaces I found very interesting for starting or engaging. Of course, there are bots everywhere. There are people who are hard set in their ways. But if the conversations get started about community safety, people are constantly complaining about, okay, my car got stolen, Cadillac converter got stolen. This is a very LA conversation.
Catalytic converter. That's the LA.
That's so LA. But it's a reflection of how unaffordable it is, right? Like, and I think that the conversation isn't just, well, there's a first entry point, which is, oh, my Cadillac converter. It's always the same thing. Got stolen. Then somebody will reply, have you filed a police report? And then somebody will reply, they never do anything when you file a police report. And then there's an opportunity to say, like, what's a different way community safety can be had, right? And then, oh, did you know our city pays, like, from our $51 million budget, like $29 million towards a police force? Like, what are our expectations with that, and what's the next line item? There's opportunities to really point to, like I said, the kind of mismanagement that could be revolutionized on a community level.
I love the idea of a next door. Not even intervention makes it sound too sort of manipulative, but like thinking about that as its own kind of weird town square. And I tend to avoid next door because of the unsavory things you find there, the bots, the racism, the spam, like there's a lot of stuff there, but you're making such a good point that's really changing my thinking of like, oh, actually this is a really great place to be and to start to like sow seeds of something that becomes community.
Yeah. And those are people for the most part who are on our block, around our block, and the only kind of like algorithmic design that's being fed us is by location versus really content. So you are getting to see parts of the internet that we might not when we're on other social media apps, that the algorithm has pretty significantly curated our feed.
Great point. All right, I'm resolving to learn next door a little better than I have. Speaking of in-person things, you've been involved in and in the founding of many activist abolitionist organizations. There's obviously, in the wake of January 2025, both the fires in Los Angeles, but also, of course,
Mm,
Trump taking office. There's been this renewed interest, particularly among folks on the left, around organizing.
mm.
I'm wondering what you're seeing in terms of how successful is that, and are there any insights from the various times in various circumstances in which you've done this, that you feel like would be good lessons as people are, trying to not just sort of join the DSA and call it a day, but start their own, even if not outright activist groups, local communities around particular social issues?
Yeah, I'll just speak from my Los Angeles experience. I know this very well, and a little bit of New York because I also still continue to call people and places in New York community. I, of course, like many, witnessed after the fires. I thankfully was out of the range, but still affected by air quality, ash all around. I think most of LA County will tell you that it was pretty inhabitable. And it's hard to have.
Uninhabitable, yeah, yeah.
Yeah. Um, it was hard to habitate right after the fires, and of course, not just the communities that were obliterated in Pacific Palisades and in Altadena, but there was a real emergence of mutual aid. And I think this is my focus: is how do we endure the collective response that happens in emergency situations and sustain it outside, because we're constantly in a crisis mode. So crisis isn't just the one event of the fires or the presidency or ICE coming to your block. It's an extension of a kind of fascist apocalypse um, that needs crisis organizing longer than that short window that we imagine. And I think what's so beautiful is, for a lot of people, once you participate in a mutual aid, um, food service, activation, clothing collection, distribution, other kind of work that I'm seeing emerge as well, alternative schooling formats. Um, you then have a practice. And once you have a practice, it's embodied. And once it's embodied, then you can take it and 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 pull it through. But again, there's a need to recognize that it's not just truncated in that moment. And I think the other thing, which is, you mentioned the DSA and how folks have been running. The things that I've been seeing is a pop-up of reading clubs, a pop-up of independent bookstores. People aren't aware, if unless you're from here, there's just been so many independent bookstores that have emerged and been the sites of not just book buying, but community learning. And so that community learning is a fundamental place for the larger politics that you mentioned, which are the formal electoral politics. And I will say, here's the lesson that I would learn from like a Zoran Mamdani run and some of the other runs that are happening today in New York. They're voting on their primaries, is that people saw this dramatic rise of a 1% polling to winning the Democratic primary to eventually winning the mayorship. But what's important to remember is Zoran Mamdani, was also working on the state level. So he organized enough to prove that he could win a seat and legislate. And sometimes what I've been seeing is people running for a larger seat. And I've seen this way before Mamdani too, and thinking that people who have large online platforms can translate that into an electoral win. But really what I've seen is uh, victorious electoral wins have been demonstrating that you can actually win, you can legislate, you can govern. And then his campaign wasn't just only online. I was in New York in February, and almost every block, his supporters were there asking, do you know who Zoran Mamdani is? And his program of affordability for New Yorkers. So
Yeah, I mean, it was 90,000 people, right?
yeah. And
Volunteers?
Yeah, so how do you enlist that kind of community support? And there's something really magical happening in New York right now. There's, Abir Kawas is running, for state senator. Uh, you have a Congress, person challenging, oh my god, I believe it's Dara Liza, who's coming from the left to challenge the moderate Democrat who's in place right now. They're both Dominican, which is great to see them face off. Um, and they're also coming together as a community supporting each other's run. And again, realizing where they have community and proven governance so that they can run, I don't want to say practical races, but it's funny because you see that dramatic rise of Zoran, but it was actually kind of it's a Cinderella story and it's practical at the same time.
Totally. And it's that classic thing that they talk about with musicians where it's like an overnight success was actually 10 years in the making.
Yes.
Yeah, that's kind of the point you're making with your
Yes.
campaign as well.
Yeah, which is what I hate to say this is my frustration with the Green Party. So much is show me how many elected officials you have had from city council to state senators to state assembly to senators to I don't think they've ever had a senator or a congressperson who's been a Green Party member. So build up, and this is my school of training. You reference the abolition work, but also it's not just movement. It's the kind of historian I am. I'm always looking from the bottom up and how those movements spring from that kind of organizing.
Mm, mm. Okay, so let's use this as our portal back to Malcolm X's idea of
Yeah,
freedom.
yeah.
If you could outline that, because yeah, that was something I wanted to ask you earlier.
There's that there yeah, there he is.
There.
So, I think you could very easily say it was a generational imperative for him. He comes out of his both his parents sorry, both his parents, being Marcus Garvey organizers. This includes his mother. They actually met as organizers um, uh, in Montreal, and then moved down to Nebraska to continue to do Marcus Garvey's Back to Africa movement work. And they were part of the meetings for United UNIA, and pamphleteering, all of that sort of stuff. And his father comes from the Deep South. His mother comes from Grenada. He talks a lot about her story of being essayed by a white, or her mother being essayed by a white man, um, and what that taught him in terms of the histories that he was carrying. And so I feel like for Malcolm, it's interesting. We think about freedom, especially within a Black radical tradition, that is this moral conscience on at the heart of the U.S. history. However, for when I started to really sit and study what he understood as some of the most, I guess I would say, magical moments of being free, was he referenced the spirit of brotherhood. You could just substitute that and make it more gender neutral. But what he was talking about was going to different places when he was traveling across Africa and the Middle East, or Swana, whatever you want to call it, um, and being treated like a brother. And so he also has this famous speech where he says that Christianity preaches um, brotherhood on Sunday, and then, you catch hell the rest of the days of the week, right? So for him, the idea of that kinship, of understanding that we are connected, um, and to be treated like kin, was for him that portal and pathway to justice.
Mhm. I love that. And how did that inform as you were, I guess, chronologically? I mean, obviously, you've spent a lot of time researching him, but I guess what I don't know is, had you already done a lot of research before? Was it Yale that you were, or Columbia?
I was at Columbia. Yeah.
Columbia, sorry. Like, was Columbia where you really got to sort of immerse yourself in these ideas? Had you already done that work and that's why you landed there? And then how did that thread into your sort of understanding of what freedom means in a context, 50 plus years in the future from when he was sort of
Yeah.
speaking and writing?
Yeah. And I'll also just add top line context where one of the more famous stories about Malcolm and how he rose in the eyes of uh, folks on the street in Harlem was defending um, uh, somebody who was a victim of police brutality and um, then marching a group of people to the police precinct demanding that he be released to a hospital so that he could get proper treatment. So it's also interesting to think about freedom in a sense of free from state violence, um, and then what can bloom when freedom from state violence is taken off the side of your neck, right? And so for Malcolm, um, there was like very much a direct witness work that was happening. Um, but to go back to the initial question, I was, I guess we have to rewind a little bit. I was home for the summer and I was in college at the time. So Columbia was my master's. I was an undergrad. My brother had two books that I hadn't read. I was a very voracious reader as a kid. I couldn't watch TV without reading a book at the same time. I guess that was the original ADHD. Uh, I was always second screening it, I guess you could say, um, or second something it. So my brother had was it Grapes of Wrath, and then Malcolm and I, or the autobiography of Malcolm X by as told to Alex Haley. And and I said, which one would you recommend? He said, those are two very different books. And I said, okay, I'm going to read the first 25 pages and decide. And I never finished Grapes of Wrath. Just continued on because you start out a story with my house was firebombed when I, was born. And then you just dive deep into the world that Malcolm paints of what he was birthed into. And I just fell so deeply in. And as I was telling folks growing up in the US, being born in a suburb of LA County and being one of the few people with an Arabic name, having that culture just so prominently on display, um, I felt really quickly marginalized when I was in public space and especially going to school. So I felt like reading the autobiography of Malcolm X was a narration of the kind of America I experienced. Of course, I'm not a Black person, but this idea of the feeling of being at the margins of a society that was designed around white male capital, that to me was at the heart of, oh, wow, I've never read this. I didn't have these kind of textbooks growing up. I didn't have Howard Zinn's, people's history of the United States. I didn't have any kind of access. Like listeners, either they're of this age or maybe they're a little bit younger, but you have to imagine what it was like to have like either a prehistoric internet or not one at all, and what it meant to like look up things, which was like, you know, Encyclopedia Britannica or going to the library and finding random books. It was a very difficult task to try to excavate what history looked like here if you also were part of an immigrant family. So, so that whole story of like, I just fell in love with Malcolm. I had a professor who I did an independent study with. You write a 25-page paper based on some kind of topic that you want to do. He was the one that taught the Malcolm X class on campus, and every organizer on campus took his class. Victor Wolfenstein, he wrote a book about Malcolm from like a Freudian and Marxist analysis, which was really interesting and fascinating. But anyways, I said, hey, can I write this paper on exploring Malcolm X or Malcolm X's political philosophy through hip hop? And he's like, sure. And so I was, as I was in the middle of writing it, I was like, it's a little bit longer than 25 pages. He's like, okay. fine. And then it ended up being 75 pages as a 25-page paper. And then Manning Marable, who I had mentioned, was at Columbia at the time. I just said, "Hey, can I just interview you?" Because as this like 20-something-year-old, I thought I was going to publish this into a book. And he was so gracious about it. And I wasn't even at Columbia at the time. And then the following year, I got in anthropology, and I messaged his office and said, "Hey, I'm at Columbia now. I'd love to work with you." And he said, "Yeah, I remember you, and my research assistant who was in our meeting also remembers you, and we thought you really understood and grasped Malcolm's message and his story. So yeah, you could be a research assistant on our project." And I will say, the story is way too long, but that's where I very much, in an active sense, learned about going to the archives, locating people in the archives, or trying to find the historical story of who somebody was, also looking at the people around them, looking at newspapers. So that was my training ground. And the Malcolm X archive at the Schomburg, which is a library in New York, they released their papers right when I was wrapping up and leaving New York. So I flew back and then looked at everything afterwards. But that's a whole nother story.
Take it away.
Well, so in 2008, they released that content. I sat there. Again, primitive, not just internet, primitive phones. At that time I did have an iPhone. Sorry,
But
folks.
it was like pre the iPhone that we
Yeah,
understand today.
yeah. But at the time too, there was like so much regulation on phones, so you couldn't bring the phone into the archive or the library. It was like contraband. You had to hide it. And so I remember at one point, so I was going through Malcolm X's travel diaries when he was traveling for 19 weeks in 1964 to Swana, Middle East, and Africa. They were there, and I was just doing preliminary scans because I was printing everything, but I was looking and looking and looking. And then I also saw the section. Malcolm almost every day was writing what he had done the day before, but he also was taking note, almost as if he was producing a Rolodex of the people he was meeting, any of their formal titles, and some other sketches for speeches that he would make. And that also, by the way, that was so fascinating to see that, to also see just the way that Malcolm was conceptualizing his separation from the nation and what he really was thinking and believing, and what he was retaining, what he wasn't retaining, and what he was eschewing in this process of self-discovery, as travel does for a lot of us. I mean, there were some things that where people felt like were new. As you said, people have been working on things for a long time. And so it was apparent that Malcolm was meditating on certain things, and some other ones were really pleasant surprises, or something you need to pay attention to. Anyways, so I'm looking, and in the Saudi Arabia section, so my mom's family is from Saudi Arabia, or they grew up in all over, mostly Lebanon, but they have Saudi citizenship. Anyways, I noticed my mom's last name was in his diary in terms of Saudi Arabia. It was kind of a common last name, but I jolted out with my phone because I needed to talk to her. I was like, "Who's this person? Who's Nawaf Yassin?" And she has a horrible memory, so she said, "I don't know who that is." And I was like, "Oh God, is this like a dead end?" And then I meet the oral historian in our family. I said, "Who's Nawaf Yassin?" It's like, we were at this wedding in Damascus, and she's like, "Oh yeah, he's your grandfather's cousin, and he lives in Lebanon." I was like, "Oh my God!" So I interviewed him, and through the documents, through interviewing him, realized, now this is going to tie up the whole witness thing in crazy ways. So when Malcolm X was guest of the state of Saudi Arabia, after he got there, because of his connections with people that he was building with in New York forever, like Mahmoud Shawarbi, Alia Ujdiya Hassan, who I write a lot about, who's kind of considered this godmother of Arab American organizing, he had those connections tie him to people while he was traveling. And in Saudi Arabia, it was very lucky that Mahmoud Shawarbi was tied to people who were tied to the state of Saudi Arabia. So he was guest of honor. And so, oh, sorry about that. He's guest of honor. And so then what that meant was he got somebody from the government, which was Nawaf Yassin, a deputy protocol officer, to be his escort everywhere. And so one of the big hurdles he mentions in the autobiography was that he doesn't have a Muslim name. So in order to go to Mecca to participate in Hajj, you have to be cleared by the Hajj court. And this is the sort of stuff that people do paperwork-wise before they go to Saudi Arabia now, right? And so he goes to the Hajj court, and Nawaf Yassin, you have to have witnesses, is one of his witnesses to be able to be approved to go to Hajj. So I was like, this is what I mean about a deeper spiritual pulse that is animating our work. And it was really interesting because part of that collection, what I also found was a stanza of a poem by Harun Hashim Rashid, who's a Gazan poet who is recounting the horrors of the Khan Yunis massacre in 1956. And Malcolm comments on this, and then he rewrites the stanza from Rashid's poem, and then he documents this trip he takes to Gaza from September 5th to September 6th, 1964, if I remember correctly. And so I go into it, and this is like 2008. I'm finding this, and there's other people who are finding this too. I wouldn't say I wasn't the only one, but I definitely wrote and produced a lot about this. And of course, again, if you're in a little bit more of a primitive internet world, then you searching for me around that wouldn't be as obvious. And somebody reads, and then I write this in my dissertation, which comes out in 2017. And if somebody finds the dissertation, the work that I did, and he writes an article that is pretty much like my whole thing. He cites me like twice, but most of the work is mine. And what's so funny is that in reproducing the poem, I was like under duress writing and finishing my dissertation, which is a common story for a lot of doctoral students. I was transcribing it, and I wrote in a part, "We will return, called to the mountains, we shall return, called to the alleys, we shall return," should be valleys. And then I've seen in the reproduction,
Oh, wow.
people reproduce alleys.
Wow.
And I was like, oh, this is so clear. You took the work and didn't cite it. And then it became this massive online phenomenon, by the way, on social media. People were putting together these reels. Did you know that Malcolm visited Gaza? And this is a story, and they would cite the guy and not my work. And wait, this is going back to gifts. This is the whole wrap up of the story. I confronted him on this because he got his subsequent academic trajectory was a lot more lucrative than mine. He got a very prestigious fellowship. He also got a Schoenberg fellowship, whatnot, to look at the archives. And I said, well, why? I mean, clearly you reproduced my error. So, and you had access to the collection. What was happening? He said, I couldn't read Malcolm X's handwriting, so I was relying on your work. And I was like, if you can't read his handwriting, shouldn't that tell you something? Maybe that's not your gift for a reason. Maybe you need to find what your gift is. So,
Wow. That is a story with twists and turns.
and so many twists and turns. And also, again, I'm not saying that I have this privileged access, but I know that Malcolm sits with me. This is something that I'm really confident and have deep conviction around because I'm being led these places and I can read his handwriting. It's notoriously not easy to read. And especially for a generation that doesn't know how to read handwriting anymore, it probably is going to be close to impossible for folks to really sit with the work and capture it. But I think and this goes back to the Freedom Doula, I think we are led by signs that in this lifetime, it's incumbent on us to become fluent in reading signs to identify if we're on our destiny. And this is not just an Islamic concept. This is an Ifa concept, West African spiritual traditions, that if you veer from your destiny, then you're going to have hard lessons to learn as opposed to realigning with what destiny has already unfolded is the direction, and free will is our choice, whether or not we are aligned with it.
Yeah, how do you navigate, I'm fascinated that you foreground spirituality in this work. It's not a move, obviously. I mean, you know better than I do that the majority of activists or historians would make. And so I really appreciate that you're doing it. And I think it's an injection of something that's much needed. When you're thinking about these kind of large questions of following signs and, following your path, how do you and free will being this thing that lives inside of that for you to embrace, with these other questions of, predetermination, like the natural sort of questions that are going to come up about, well, how do you have free will if you have a prescribed fate, and what does that mean? So how are you thinking about that? Because you're obviously like a very, the word agentic is in the sort of the slipstream right now because of all the AI questions, but you're a very agentic person. You've done so much stuff, so nobody could possibly accuse you of being a passive observer of your life. So how are you squaring those things in your spiritual understanding? And if, by the way, if we land in a spiritual place that's too personal, just tell me and we'll talk
No,
about something else.
it's totally fine. I wish that there was more opportunities to follow the stream of s spiritual unfolding, because I feel like it's the heart of our crisis is spiritual disconnection, and once we attend to that, then we can attend to some of the other questions that feel like they're urgent, which is the political climate, which is the environmental climate itself. But it really, for me, does verge from or originate from a space of deep spiritual disconnection. And I think going back to Malcolm has this quote that, and he uses the he as gender neutral when talking about God. He said, "When God is with you, He will give you signs." And so, what I'm inferring from that, and as part of the way that I interact with faith or spiritual guidance, is that there is a world of signs that I think my work is to become fluent in being able to read the signs. And becoming fluent is actually being a very active liver of life. It's not sitting back and waiting to see, did the crescent moon appear in like Jupiter and Venus on this time for me to like sign a document. No, and that's also, I'm a avid astrology reader as well. And that's part of my Islamic historical coding. But I would also say it's that work. I think the way that I'm reading some of this stuff is that there is these innate gifts, as I started this conversation talking about, and you could either call this unfolding destiny, or you could call this a exploration of what that means to come into um, to come into conversation with your gifts and then rise to the occasion of fully embodying it and animating in this life. I think that the the when we go back to this sort of question of where's free will and all of that, you can decide, which many of us have, that I will not, that I will actually disassociate from that world and predetermine a path of a certain kind of ambition, which I'm not saying you can't be ambitious, but an ambition towards something that might have been designed by the mind instead of understood by the soul. So, and by soul, I mean this integrative way of pulling in knowledge from inner sight, from our senses, from our mind, from our body, that helps us understand what the soul is. So I think when I read this idea of like pre-planning and pre-designing what you're going to manifest, sometimes that stuff is, oh, okay, I innately and intuitively got that download because I am listening to the signs. And so now I'm designing a game plan for that. And some of that other stuff is forcing a door that isn't that open to you. So you're going to be breaking through and having a really difficult time getting through obstacles. And some of it is also lesson learned. I think the bigger question for me, overarching all of this, is always, is there a test of a lesson learning, or is there a test of surrender that I need to implement in this moment when I'm at a crossroads? So I think that's for me a more difficult question. And I always feel like the signs will tell me that, whether or not which road I am on, and then I think in Ifa, in Islam, you can choose something that wasn't necessarily your destiny. You might return back to that destiny. And that's the whole game of free will versus the predestination or destiny.
Mm.
I don't know
And
if that
yeah,
makes sense. I sometimes just get into a real heady esoteric space when I'm thinking about this work.
I mean, you like there are these very, very simple questions that we all I think when we're younger, we ask them a lot, and then we
Mm,
stop asking them as we get older, like, how did life begin?
mm,
Where do you go when you die? There are these like huge questions. So I think we have to access them in all the different ways we can. So I appreciate that. Yeah, that you brought us into the heady space. What I'd love to do is kind of link it with the
mm.
somatic side of your practice.
Yeah, yeah.
And how does yeah your own somatic practice fit in with these questions in your spiritual journey? But also, what what is the role of healing, kind of going back to an earlier moment in the conversation? I realize I'm weighting this question too much. There's too many things in this question.
Oh,
So maybe
no.
let's start with just the somatic side. Like, how does the somatic dimension fit into these spiritual questions and yeah, like finding your path, kind of finding the signs, everything that you were just sort of outlining.
Yeah, I think that our body, and this is something I'm bearing in mind from a non trying to be a non-ableist, will tell us things. And I, you don't have to be worn down to be sick, but a lot of times being worn down can invite illness and sickness. Um, and you could be doing everything right and have uh, non-visible illness or visible illness. So I don't want to take that out of account. That context is always there when I'm thinking about this. Um, I I do think that there's a deep division in the Western civilizational context between the mind and the body and everything else, clearly. But we'll just take that distinction. We have the Rene Descartes, I think, therefore I am, which is also a distortion of some Sufi work he was reading that he used as the framework. And then the Western civilizational canon in the Enlightenment period starts to just double down and emphasize the idea of the mind as organizing all ways of knowing and orienting to the world. And so I think this disembodiment that is happening has come out of the mind being the ruler. And I'll give you another clear example of what that also looks like. Psychology as a field, or psychoethics, was the study of the soul. And then it gets taken on by Western academia and it becomes study of the mind. And so then we have a couple generations of academic thinkers that really diagnose who we are through conditions that they mutually agree on as a consensus. As I talk a lot about this with the pathologizing of a woman's wildness or femme folks, the idea of hysteria, dysfunction of the womb, as being a diagnostic that's in the DSM two or DSM, I don't remember if it's 102, but all the way up until the 1980s. And so we're sort of relying on these fields to have this external kind of diagnosis. And when I talk about the embodied work and the soul work, I think they're two that are intimately tied with each other. Of course, the mind is, but this idea that if you just persevere mind over matter, that kind of framework is a remnant and a vestige of that sort of study of like the mind from enlightenment. And so what we have a lot of times is, if you guys have noticed, you have a lot of tech oligarch elites who are trying to chase immortality because they think it's a mind quest towards keeping the body alive, right? And so this going into that other direction of being embodied and feeling where your emotions are locked into is a scary, vulnerable process. And that requires you to also confront death, dying, pain, which is everything that um, like patriarchal capitalist society wants you to believe that you can buy your way out of, right? Or buy a certain kind of supplement for that, or going to hyperbaric chamber. I mean, I do those things out of curiosity, but also being attendant to what my body is saying. Um, I had this period. I'll just round it a little bit to make it less abstract. I had this period after I was, as I mentioned, under duress, 2017 to finish my dissertation. My dissertation advisor told me that you have this arbitrary deadline. If you're not done with your dissertation edits by this point, then we're going to terminate you from the program, which means everything that I had done for 7 years was going to be erased and canceled. And I would no longer be in a program. And so I was just in hyper mode. After I turned it in and was done, I went straight to Greece and worked with refugee communities in the island of Chios and parts of Athens and Lesbos. And it, for some folks, that might sound like it's like, oh, just work with volunteer communities. But think in these geography and going to Greece, right? Like people might conceive of this as a vacation, but think about what it means to be at Delaney Detention Center every day working with folks in a similar kind of way. The refugees were very much organized around the violence of the state and hiding them, institutionalizing them away, trying to push back their boats. I mean, so many have perished in the Mediterranean Sea and the Aegean Sea. So anyways, I was working on the front lines, literally like learning first aid, how to take people out of water, feed them, respond to like fires that ravaged their tents. I mean, crazy sort of stuff. And then I was also working through a breakup. And so all those things were hitting me. And if I show you pictures of how I looked then, you would be shocked because I just had like all the life of me was sunken in. I was really bloated. I was carrying so much I wasn't working through. And then part of my own response to the trauma was to live in the trauma, to continue living because the PTSD was so familiar. And in my PhD programs, I hadn't mentioned, I just experienced so much sexual harassment as well. So that space was not a safe space. No spaces are safe spaces, really, in the kind of society we're in. But it was heightened to an intense level with so many different vectors that were poking at me or, producing this reality. And so after that, I went into, I renewed my practice in a more intentional way and, got a integrative doctor to like really sit with what's going on in my body and then return to some of the practices that I learned in another era when I was when first entering into the PhD program and experienced some really deep depression and got myself out by learning yoga and breath work and telling myself I was going to connect with my body in a non-athletic competitive way, having been an athlete with my body before, which again, the mind over matter, stretching yourself beyond its limits, and how to gently see what my body is telling me is discomfort or pain, and how to distinguish between those things as portals of openings. So I would say, just to kind of like wrap this up, which is so fascinating, when you think about the work that's being done in ancient wisdom practices like yoga, of course, yoga, the asanas, which is the physical movement, is one of the limbs, the many limbs of yoga. You are also exposed to a world that gets remixed in Western academic context through the mind. So like, I'll give you an example of something that I learned in yoga that I carry with me a lot, which kind of goes back to what you're talking about, which is this sort of tension that creates openings. When we were talking about how do you choose like between what is destiny, what is free will, that's a tension point that invites an opening. And in yoga, it's the union of opposites, it's to be yoked. And so that also comes from yin and yang, as we know, or that's part of that kind of tradition. And in the West, they call it, they call it this sort of historical materialism that's
Dialectical.
Dialectics. Yes, exactly. Thank you. And so that that dialectic is something that's talked about as like ideologies opposing versus these embodied experience of what it means to have this opposition. And do you practice yoga or have you done yoga?
I don't, sadly. I have in the past, and I know
You
that
don't
I
have
need to.
you don't have to, but you're familiar with some of it.
Of course, yeah, yeah.
So let's say you're doing even a simple pose, like a mountain pose, and you're standing here, you think you're standing, but really the active motion is you're pressing so far or so heavily into your feet that it's actually allowing you to rise. And the more that you're also engaging your abs, I mean, you could do this now too. The more you engage your abs, you feel this release from your shoulders. So there's this kind of contradiction of opposites, right? The more you engage the abs, the release of the shoulders, the more you press on down on the feet, the more you rise. And coming and being okay, not coming and just being okay, but seeing how some of these contradictions produce openings for you is kind of the work of that embodied practice.
Mm. Well, and what you're describing, I'm gonna try to make this question tight.
Okay.
Um, it strikes me like in researching your practice more deeply before this conversation, that there are these kind of openings throughout your professional practice as well. So you're talking about this with academia, and the very hyper, Western, like the example that you're giving from the DSM and hysteria is sort of the perfect example. This kind of like dominating relationship of knowledge. Um, and yet you've, received a PhD from a prestigious institution. You teach at prestigious institutions, which many see as the kind of, the some of the like, gleaming institutions sort of embodying this idea. You also, and one thing we haven't talked about in this conversation is talking about Arab and Muslim representation in Hollywood, and how Hollywood itself is rooted in these Western psychologies.
Mm.
And so then trying to play with what it means to um, advocate for representation, but what does representation look like when the system itself, it's the master's tools will never dismantle the master's house. And yet you're playing with that tension. And so I'm seeing all these openings, and I realize I failed at being pithy with this, but I guess I'd love to hear you speak to that, like how that idea of openings exists in your practice across these different dimensions.
I still struggle with it. I think I'm sometimes a little bit too much ideologically a purist, even though, as you mentioned, I like my own professional history exposes and demonstrates a lot more of an encounter with the like traditional Western institutions, especially academia. And I think academia is one of the last vestiges of maintaining the idea of Western superiority over the rest of the world.
Mm.
And that's why it is one of the biggest battlegrounds, as you've seen with the Trump administration, to go to town. It's not just that they want to divest from education, public education, and privatize it. It is who are they attacking, as you said? They're attacking the most elite institutions because that is where the notion of producing knowledge for the state to reproduce itself comes from. So that's why Harvard was the place where Trump pointed and said, Harvard, you have to dismantle the religion and public life program. And they said, sure, boss, we did that. People thought that Harvard fought back. They did for some of the things, but other things they just laid on the ground and they said, sure, boss, we'll do it because this is too much of a public spectacle for us. And so we'll just turn over and respond to you. So that, yes. So yes, and when we're talking about working within Hollywood TV and film, it's a place again I didn't even pre-design, and I think this kind of goes back to my ethos of sitting with what is the root of the root, which is a Rumi question, and of course we know what his thread was that he was. We might know what his thread was that he was pulling it towards, but when I'm asking that question, I'm asking not like what industry do I want to enter? Or what TV show do I want to make? It's hopefully a deeper question of what kind of intervention am I emotionally, psychologically, spiritually making? And so then the answers back are, for me, the signs of the doors being open pretty easily. Like I entered Hollywood, I get constantly asked questions from social media, from folks from social media, through my website, through people in person. Hey, can we meet? Can you tell me about how you designed your path into Hollywood? I want to break in. I was like, I didn't design a path. I was not an MFA. I was not a VFA in filmmaking at all. I was just a friend to Rami and telling him the truth about what I saw and telling him my own commentary about his comedy, his writing, and he's just become such a beautiful, powerful artist for inviting the, I hope at times nourishing, loving critiques, um, and knowing that I saw that he was really on the crust, or I'm not thinking about the wave, a wave at the top of the wave, and really going to make a major splash, and he has, and he continues to. And so I think I usually say, and I haven't been doing a good job of this, divine, just lead me with your signs where I'm supposed to go. And then I say, I listen, I'm like, oh man, okay, fine, I'll go in this direction. And if not, when I'm pushing too hard, it's not working for me. It's not happening. I have so many examples and stories of like, okay, I want to try to get back into academia. I want a postdoc. I can't get a postdoc. What's happening? I can't, I can get a job abroad. Do I want to take it? Is this right for me? All these sort of questions are part of the deliciousness of the mystery of life. And so going back to Hollywood and how not just like what's happening institutionally, which I think not just me, but so many people will tell you, and especially uh, uh, like women of color, folks of color will tell you we're having, and a lot of people, unless you're like elite writers who had credits for a while, this is a very difficult time to be in the industry, which is making a lot of people question what kind of storytelling they can tell and where it belongs. And so when we're talking about Arabs and Muslims, I just contributed to this anthology that's going to come out called Muslim Futures. And mine looks at a future of a clandestine group of these Sufi warriors, basically, who are linking up with other indigenous ancient wisdom communities and trying to basically design a climate hoax that only like the tech oligarchs they believe will believe, so they could leave the planet fast enough so that we can regenerate it. So the parasites will go. And so anyways, it goes into this future of not contending with the fact that when they design this, that their people would believe the hoax too. And so the big question is, are those our people? Do we try to bring them back, or are they not? And so that's the unfolding of the story. But basically, there's a graphic novel collection for those, and I'm thinking about making that into a short story. But to go even deeper to the root of your question, um, and thinking about what is Western civilizational culture, and how does that influence representation? How does that influence what does storytelling look like? And so we have these conventions like the hero's journey and the trio, which comes from the Freudian id, ego, superego. And the hero's journey, people believe, is just from Joseph Campbell, but Joseph Campbell gets that from Jung, and Jung gets that from being kind of an anti-Semitic. And we can go into that a little bit, because Jung was Freud's student, and Freud and Jung had a beef, and that beef emerged, or how that beef translated into was Freud moving away from archetypes, and then Jung really doubling down on archetypes, and Jung's archetypes really being rooted on what only Aryans can do and what distinguishes Aryans. So, and then this is what the hero's journey is built on, is the dream that Aryan can take.
Wow.
Yeah.
I didn't
I'll
know
go
that.
more into it, but I mean, I'm gonna write something about this because it really goes to the heart of a lot of our storytelling conventions come from psychology, from Western academic psychology. And then, I did this whole dramatic buildup and gave a lecture to folks about like the emergence of the mind. Why that's so fundamental is then you understand the storytelling universe and the narrative ecosystem that you're being jolted into, and how stories, emotions, conflict, character development emerges, rises, resolves, right? And so to truly sit with that and where the genesis of this, the genealogy of this is to also ask, I think, okay, what is a decolonial storytelling model and format and framework? And so I've, again, been sitting with a category that academia minimized as being, fanciful tales, myth, and folklore, and how communities do storytelling. So that's my next project is the story of storytelling. Uh,
Mm.
and I will also credit one of my students. She came in with a project that was asking some of these questions, and I was trying to guide her to develop it, but it emerged into us working together. Her name's Eve. And we really put together, we did this whole pitch doc of like a docu-series and podcast series where we would explain all of this history, but more of the episodes would go, in an agenic way into different communities we've sat with, we want to encounter, we want to learn from about not just what the storytelling model is, but how that gets told. You know, uh, oh my God, Cynthia Wilson, who's Danae, and she's one of the founders of Women for Bears Ears. She told Eve when she was doing this project that in her culture, stories are earned. So if you think about it in this capitalist commerce model of storytelling that emerges from Hollywood, that's almost a unacceptable answer, right? That you can't put stories on the free market to try to get as many viewers and consumers as possible, but that stories are just meant for, maybe somebody on their journey and when they're supposed to hear a story, right? Instead of like designing hodgepodge with that,
Yeah.
like, or just again, being able to afford to buy a story, right?
Yeah, and that there's some mixture of what you were talking about earlier in terms of fate, but also accountability and responsibility. That um, it's not just a story vending machine approach. It's like
Yes.
or gifts. Thinking of gifts, you were talking about gifts earlier. It's something that can only be gifted to you, perhaps in that framework. It's a really powerful way of
That
positioning that.
that's a good framework, story gifting. Yeah. I like.
Mm, mm. We speaking of which, we have a question from For a Better World, um, who writes, "Are you creating stories to expose the fears and ignorance driving the destruction of civilization, and how we can steward the good and discard the bad?"
I would say half yes, which is, or I hope to, or I pray to. I don't like saying hope. I like to say pray. I pray to. Um, I would say for myself as a creative, as an artist, I like to ask myself how I can transcend the normative framework of good and bad and find the questions that are underlying. So steward is a beautiful approach. I do think that destruction and creation should exist, but the issue we're having now is that we are in a Western civilizational cultural mindset that the dominant ideology is destruction. So we need a rebalancing, we need a harmonizing of the circle of life of yes, when we say we need to be pro-life, sure, we need to be pro-life, but we also need to be pro a certain kind of death, right? Like there's a vibrant life that is escaping us because of these systems that we should be able to experience, everybody should be able to experience. And then there's a dignified death that is also being taken away from people. And so that's what I pray to do. I think sometimes I also mimic, this goes back to your question about what happens when you're really in the master's tools is I get stuck in the deconstruction. And that's how I entered the space of trying to analyze Arabs and Muslims in TV and film. And then the invitation that Rami gave me with first being a creative advisor, then a staff writer, then a co-executive producer, which is so beautiful and amazing, was something I wasn't prepared for in a long time, although I was an organizer working around abolition was, okay, I could tell you how to very obviously identify, or how to identify a anti-Arab, anti-Muslim stereotype, trope, trap, plot line. But what am I doing to build out a story where it's not good Muslim stories or good Arab stories? It's people that could exist in their wholeness in a storytelling format.
Mm. Yeah, an emphasis on honesty and authenticity.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. And um, the messiness is also part of the beauty. I think we're it goes back to Malcolm's speech when Ronald Stokes was murdered by the LAPD in LA. He was at the uh, memorial, and that's where his famous "Who taught you to hate yourself?" The roots of a tree. If you hate your hair, if you hate any part of yourself, how can you love yourself? And just was communicating the message of embracing the beauty of who we are and how important it was. Um, that Our messiness is also beautiful.
Love that. I could stay doing this conversation for a very long time. I've kept you longer than I told you I'd keep you, and I'm so grateful you spent the time. I have one more question for you, if you have time
Absolutely,
for it.
yeah.
Amazing. Okay. Because one thing that's come up across a number of these different questions, is, and I'll just sort of distill it to where my brain goes, which is like, how do you think about the relationship between the to use archetypes, but not in any racist or anti-Semitic way, um, the maybe warrior archetype and the steward archetype, the righteous anger and the focus on healing, because I see both of those poles, for lack of a better word, in your practice, like a time to be bold and to sort of embrace whatever that fire and aggression is, and other times to really focus on healing and stewarding. And those can be contradictory in particular settings. So I'm wondering, like, thinking about all these different pieces, and particularly, like, we see this discourse around Malcolm X so often, particularly as Martin Luther King Jr. has been sort of strategically whitewashed and sort of softened. So yeah, how are you thinking about those pieces, where they fit in you, and kind of what it means in your practice, and what you'd like to see in the world, and when we should tap into those spaces? And so yeah, throwing that all over to you.
I see different times calling for different versions of our gifts, I guess you could say. I think about a you've heard of the Enneagram.
I have, yeah.
Did you
But
know?
but please describe, just for folks who haven't.
So when people hear Enneagram, they might associate it with an identity test that exposes what type of learner you are, what type of leader you are. But there is a theory that the Enneagram, so you could go online and take an Enneagram test, and I think it might be like INJT and EN or whatever. There is a theory that the Enneagram comes from the Sufi Enneagram, which was designed, and you'll find this very interesting, with s- different kinds of qualities. And this is an interpretation from a thinker named Laleh Bakhtahir. Um, Different kind of qualities that needed to be meted out in response to certain, it was almost like a medical diagnosis of our ethics. And if you were a little too loud and aggressive, you might want to practice a little bit of temperance. If you were feeling insecure and weak, it might call you to courage. Um, and so, but at the center of all of that is justice. And so, kind of moving around all the different modulations of those ethics or qualities in order to get towards justice. So I think, kind of goes back to how we started. What does it mean to be a witness in this situation? Am I adding to the injustice, or am I adding to the justice? There's also a saying within Islamic hate tradition about the when you witness an injustice, you must try to the strongest one of the ways to do it is to change it by your hand, but the weakest way to do it is changing it by your voice or speaking. So I think there's so many theories of ways that are what you're called to do. And I think that what I like to prescribe for people in kind of this instance and scenario for them is really to get to the root of what might be your generational story with spiritual practice. And it doesn't mean you have to remain in it, but what is the generational story? So you understand what is the ancestors that you are communicating with. The timeline that we are in now has kind of a timeline, a genealogy you could excavate, right? So what is that pointing you towards? And I think for me, you didn't ask this question, but I'm going in this direction.
Take it away.
When I think about some of the saddest things about what happened to creating people called white people was this big disconnection from land, spirit, people, culture, and only giving in return the idea of race and consumption. And that's it, right? And ownership, right? Like those are the values of a whiteness that that overimposes itself and subsumes. There's a lot of Irish Irish folks who had a Celtic background, who believed in fairies, who had this like amazing cosmology of what it means to be connected to the land and the spirit world. And so I think that I see that as like these moments when we're feeling, and it's, by the way, not just white folks. Most of our traditions have been hijacked with the most conservative versions of the story of connecting to spirit. Or maybe it's not even like disconnecting from spirit. And so I think there's actually this beautiful opportunity, this moment of curiosity where it invites you to ask, what were the practices of my ancestors? Not just my grandmother, not just my great-grandmother, but even more so. And what were the practices of the land? And what were the practices of the spirit world and the sentient world in relation to us? And not that the past is perfect, but it is information. It is a communication to where not just our journey goes in like a progressive linear fashion, but how we can return back to the circular to reinitiate the cycle of vibrant life and dignified death.
Compost.
Yeah, compost. Well, it's so funny that you say that. Oh my God, I can't believe I forgot his last name. Akamalafe.
Oh, yeah, of course.
Yeah, so
Legend.
Bio has a very famous saying about composting the human, and I tend to agree, which is like another kind of hot take or controversial sort of thing I will just add as we're closing is I do think a lot of where we have gone astray and, astray from our own gifts was producing the construct of the human, investing in it, and also trying to organize around trying to humanize ourselves when the construct of the human was such the emergence of it was a kind of form of centering the idea of a group of people that are more important than the rest of the planet.
And people who are more important than other people.
Yes, yeah, and that's where, yes, the subhuman emerges, and then that category of race comes from the category of human.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Gotta break free. On that note, there's a quick, I think, a button question from For a Better World, who asks, do you see a future where we bring together the best of our diversity and civilizations?
I love the idea of, I would say yes, with the kind of demonstration of the gut biome, right? There's no real bad bacteria. There's overgrowth. There's a dysbiosis that's happening. So the best kind of gut diversity or the best kind of microbiome is diversity, right? Like you also see that with plant life. We were just talking about gardening. There's certain plants that um, grow really well when there's not just like pollination of the bees, but there's a reason why beans, squash, and corn were grown together as the
And
three
sisters.
sisters. Yeah. And there's and this is the sadness. The sadness is like I think not just in terms of like colonization, I think of industrialization, and industrialization had us look at the land and saying not just monocropping, but that turns into monoculture, right? So monocropping was how much can we extract from the earth for this one crop to sell into the market, because more volume means more production, which means, I mean, more production means more volume means more consumption. And so we just kind of got cradle to grave instead of cradle to cradle with like the mono-ness of it all, and forced the world to do monocultural um, industries. And so, yeah, don't you agree? Oh, so I'll let you.
Well, you can feel free to answer that if you want. I feel bad that I've kept you as long as I have. So you tell me.
Well, sure, we can go into this.
All right. So the question for folks catching this later, the question is, don't you agree that existential fears are what are driving conservative extremism today?
I think for me, sitting with what I've been hearing is a lot of this is an outgrowth of an impulse of domination, and the impulse of domination is part of the continuation of that structure is fear mongering and fear making. So I think we have to get at what models are overwhelmingly models of domination. Um, yeah, it's again a little abstract, but yeah.
No, it's important. Domination is part of why we have overshoot, which is part of why we're running out of all our resources and destroying our biosphere. So it's all very connected. Um, so yeah, for a better world, thank you for your great questions. Thank all of you who have been here watching, listening, etc., and for folks in the future. Um, and most of all, thank you, Dr. Maytha Alhassen, for being on this Reality Studies Live, which will be an Urgent Futures podcast episode soon. This is a real privilege and joy to speak to you.
Thank you. Thank you for letting me be so loquacious.
Oh, it's amazing. I'm glad you were.
And then thank you for, for also what you're doing with the land to regenerate it. And may we all find ways to relationally regenerate.
Amazing. All right. We'll talk soon.
Okay, peace.